During the Cold War, more than 50,000 Soviet military aircraft were deployed or exported to proxy states across the globe. The U.S. intelligence community knew every rivet, every rotor blade, every weakness on paper. But knowing something on paper and holding it in your hands, that's a completely different weapon. So in 1981, deep inside war-torn Africa, American intelligence operatives did something almost no one believed was possible. They stole a fully operational Soviet Mi-24 Hind helicopter, one of the most feared gunships on the planet, right from under the nose of Soviet-aligned forces. How did they pull it off? And what did it cost them? Stay with me, because the answer changes everything you thought you knew about Cold War espionage. In this video, we're breaking down one of the most audacious intelligence operations of the entire Cold War. We'll cover how the mission was planned, who carried it out, what the U.S. learned from that helicopter, and why it mattered for every future conflict that followed. This isn't just military history. This is a masterclass in how technological intelligence, what analysts call techint, shapes the battlefield for decades. And if you want more deep dives like this into covert military operations and Cold War strategy, hit that subscribe button now. We cover this every week. Now, let's go back to Africa, 1981. First, you need to understand what the Mi-24 Hind actually was, because without that context, you can't understand why the U.S. was willing to risk an international incident to get one. The Mi-24, NATO codename Hind, entered Soviet service in 1972, and it was unlike anything the West had ever seen. Think of it this way, most military helicopters of that era were either troop carriers or attack platforms. The Hind was both. At the same time, it could carry up to 8 fully armed soldiers in its rear compartment, while simultaneously unleashing rockets, gun pods, and anti-tank missiles from its stub wings. Defense analysts at the time reportedly called it a flying infantry fighting vehicle. It had armored crew compartments. It could absorb small arms fire. And it was fast, faster than most attack helicopters NATO had in the field. By the late 1970s, Soviet-backed governments in Angola and Ethiopia were deploying Hinds against Western-aligned guerrilla forces across the continent. Fighters supported by the U.S. and its allies were being slaughtered by a machine they had no countermeasure for. Pentagon officials reportedly described the Hind as a significant threat multiplier, military language for, "This thing is turning the tide of wars." The U.S. desperately needed to know how it worked, from the inside. Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. How do you build a countermeasure against a weapon you've never touched? By 1979, U.S. intelligence had gathered significant data on the Hind through signals intelligence and aerial reconnaissance, spy satellites, communications intercepts, the whole toolkit. But there were critical gaps. Specifically, the avionics systems, the targeting radar, and the armor composition. According to defense historians, the CIA and Defense Intelligence Agency, the DIA, were particularly interested in the Hind's electronic warfare suite. This is the system that allows a helicopter to detect incoming missiles and deploy countermeasures, flares, chaff, electronic jamming signals. Without understanding that system, U.S.-backed forces couldn't develop effective anti-Hind weapons. Here's something that puts this in stark perspective. The Stinger missile, the shoulder-fired anti-aircraft weapon that would later decimate Soviet helicopters in Afghanistan, was still in development at this time. Getting inside a Hind wasn't just curiosity. It was potentially a war-deciding intelligence coup. The opportunity came in Chad, a landlocked country in north-central Africa that had been mired in civil conflict for over a decade. Multiple factions, foreign backers, and shifting front lines had turned Chad into what analysts called a proxy battleground for Cold War powers. Libyan forces, backed by Soviet equipment, including the Hind, were operating in northern Chad in support of one faction. According to reports from defense historians and journalists who later investigated the operation, U.S. intelligence, working with Egyptian intermediaries and local anti-Libyan factions, identified a specific Hind unit operating in the region. The plan wasn't a direct military raid. That would have caused an international crisis. Instead, operatives reportedly worked through third-party channels, quietly coordinating with local fighters to capture a Hind that had been forced to land due to mechanical failure or combat damage. The exact mechanics of the capture remain partially classified. Some accounts suggest the crew was neutralized, taken prisoner, or persuaded to defect, while the aircraft was still largely intact. What is documented through declassified summaries and investigative reporting is that a functional Mine 24 was secured and transported out of Africa for technical exploitation. The helicopter was reportedly flown to a U.S. facility, with some accounts pointing to Egypt's involvement as a transit and testing partner where American engineers and intelligence analysts tore it apart. Systematically, methodically, every circuit, every armor panel, every bolt. Now here's where it gets genuinely extraordinary. And this is the part that most people, even military history enthusiasts, don't fully appreciate. What U.S. engineers reportedly discovered inside the Hind reshaped American helicopter doctrine for the next 20 years. First, the armor. The Hind's cockpit armor was significantly more effective than U.S. analysts had estimated from external observation alone. Standard small arms fire, the weapons most U.S.-backed guerrilla forces were using, would not reliably penetrate it. That meant the weapons being supplied to anti-Soviet fighters were largely inadequate against the Hind's most vulnerable positions. Second, the targeting and weapons systems. According to defense analysts who have written about the program, the Hind's fire control system, while effective, had exploitable limitations in its radar coverage. There were blind spots, angles of approach where the helicopter's defensive systems were less effective. Information like that doesn't just help you shoot down one helicopter. It helps you design the tactics that every pilot and ground unit uses going forward. Third, and most consequentially, the analysis of the Hind's electronic countermeasures directly informed the development of weapon systems that would be deployed in Afghanistan just a few years later. The Stinger missile and the tactics used to maximize its effectiveness against Soviet helicopters reportedly incorporated lessons learned from exactly this kind of hands-on technical exploitation. Some defense historians have argued, cautiously, that the intelligence gathered from operations like this one contributed to the conditions that made the Soviet-Afghan war so costly for Moscow. One captured helicopter, one clandestine operation in the African desert, ripples that reached Kabul. So let's bring this home with 3 key takeaways. 1. The Cold War was fought not just with missiles and armies, but with intelligence, patience, and the willingness to take calculated risks in obscure corners of the world. 2. A single captured piece of equipment, one helicopter, can generate intelligence that shapes doctrine, weapons development, and battlefield outcomes for decades. 3. Africa was not a sideshow in the Cold War. It was an active theater where the superpowers probed each other's capabilities and resolve, often through proxy conflicts the world barely noticed. Now here's the question I want to leave you with. If this kind of operation was happening in 1981, what do you think is happening right now, in 2024, that we won't know about for another 40 years? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every one. If this video gave you something to think about, hit the like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who care about real military history and geopolitics. Subscribe if you haven't already. We publish deep dives like this every day.